Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Meanwhile Here on Earth. This program features in-depth conversations with the leading names in the subjects of UFOs, abductees, the paranormal, panel discussions, and the very best and brightest of the next generation of writers and researchers. Meanwhile Here on Earth, the show breaking new ground in alternative talk with your intrepid host, veteran investigative writer and researcher, Peter Robbins.
This is Meanwhile Here on Earth. I am your host, Peter Robbins, and welcome or welcome back as the case may be. I wanted to begin with just a few words about my weekend. I have the privilege of being an organizer, a co-founder, a speaker, and often an MC at the Exeter, New Hampshire UFO Festival and Conference. The event, like about everything else in the world, has been on hiatus for 2 years. And as we have headed toward this past weekend, we really didn't know what to expect. It is an event that is organized every year by the local chapter of the Kiwanis, without whom it would not be possible. And it distinguishes itself from any other UFO conference or related event that I'm aware of anywhere, in that once all of our bills are paid, every cent goes to children's services in the Seacoast Greater Exeter area, something everybody involved is very proud of. And this weekend was a smash success. From what I understand from my friends at the Kiwanis, on the first day of the conference festival, more than 600 people were either in the room at the conference or taking part in festival activities, probably close to that number on Sunday. And we will be in a position, hopefully, to make the largest donation we have ever made to children's services. Our featured speaker was Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist Ralph Blumenthal, talking about his superb biography of Dr. John Mack. He's joined by a great roster of speakers, a terrific cadre of supporters, and I just can't thank anyone enough for taking part, and all of us knowing that this event is now secure to move on into the future. Now, that said, I've given a lot of thought to how to best introduce this show, because it is, in a very important way, distinguished from any of the other broadcasts we've done here on Meanwhile Here on Earth, in that the subject is something that nobody is aware of, because it has simply not been released yet. I'm talking about a new book that will be published in a matter of days in the UK, although it will be available wherever through Amazon Books, written by a friend of mine who I've known for 15 years, who has had lifelong UFO experiences. And I don't think he anticipated writing a book, but circumstances several years ago suggested to him that he should, and he did. And in May, when I visited him and his partner in Lincolnshire, England, after dinner the first night, he told my sister and I, who was traveling with me, that he had written this manuscript, and would I be interested in taking a look at the introduction, first chapter. When you're a writer and colleagues, friends, or strangers ask you to read something, it can be dodgy. You hope that you're going to like it, because if not, you will either have to make believe you did or tell them you didn't. And especially if it's somebody who is a person that you respect and admire, all the more so. I imagine Steve could write. Author's name is Steve Aspin, but I had no idea how well he could research. Also, the many things he had confided to me over the years about his lifelong experiences, which I have kept in absolutely the strictest of confidence, were now going to be made public. And after reading the introduction in the first chapter, I was really quite taken aback. Um, it was more than I anticipated, to put it mildly. And once I was back home and he had finished polishing the manuscript per se, he sent it, I read it cover to cover, and came away feeling, and I think many of you know me well enough to know I don't exaggerate or spin things, that it has the potential of being the most significant and wide-reaching book regarding the UFO phenomena since Communion by Whitley Strieber was published in 1987. The book is called Out of Time, and you are the very first people outside of a very small circle to see this cover or to hear about this book. Again, Steve has never done an interview in his life that I'm aware of, and certainly not on this subject. And so we will be spending the first hour with myself and Steve, and we will be joined by several colleagues to discuss their reading of the manuscript, who I secured Steve's permission some time back to allow them to read it with the understanding that it remained confidential. Again, this time next week, it will be out and people will begin talking about it. If you go to the website of the book, which is very simply outoftimebook.info, you will read, to start with, in Out of Time, author Steve Aspin attempts to write a crossover work about the enduring worldwide reports of alien abduction. It is intended for both those familiar with historic published case material and the curious reader unfamiliar with the decades of serious research on this superficially improbable phenomenon. He details his lifelong personal experiences and the relationships he built with leading researchers during his years of investigating this phenomenon. He has at all times attempted to approach the subject with critical thoroughness and intellectual rigor. Although successfully normalized in popular culture to become background noise or a minor comic footnote in otherwise busy lives, the subject has real and serious implications for both the individual experiencer and human society collectively. That said, welcome, Steve Aspin.
Hi, Peter.
How are you doing in beautiful Lincolnshire today?
We've got a really severe electrical storm, and it's affecting our internet connection. So I'm hoping that the audience is going to be able to hear us properly, or hear me properly, because we've had a bit of a problem getting this connection going. So let's
so far, so good.
Yeah, so far, so good. Thank you for your fantastic introduction, Pete.
Well, every word of it was earned, and I'm still reeling a bit in that you know me better than a lot of people, and my dedication to this subject. I got involved immediately over 40 years ago when my late sister Helen imparted information to me, conscious memories of her abduction experience, a subject not only that I was unfamiliar with at the time, but I had never heard of except for maybe a background reference to the hills as a child. And I guess I've been waiting for a book quite like yours without realizing it. The same way that in the world of UFO studies, when John Mack came on the scene, somebody who was incredibly intelligent, authoritative, highly qualified, a psychiatrist, a Pulitzer Prize-winning writer, charismatic, well-spoken, filled that bill. And your book is unassuming in that there's little or no ego involved. You are simply thinking out loud to us. And we're familiar, those of us that are involved in UFO studies, with a growing body of literature by people who've had experiences or been taken. I'm familiar with most of those books, but this holds itself, again, at a slight distance and weaves in with your personal narrative a very concise, very well-researched history of major UFO events and complements it with a separate, concise history of major abduction events and key individuals involved in the study. Can you begin by telling us what was it that caused you to cross that line from somebody who had had these experiences, is now retired happily, living in a beautiful home with your amazing partner, and your time is your own. You could do anything. You certainly didn't have to labor at this. And as you know, anybody who has tried to write a serious book knows, it's real work. What was it that caused you to cross that line, Steve, and commit yourself to this project?
It's very difficult to pin it down to one thing. Peter, you know that I worked for a few years with Dr. David Jacobs of Temple University to recover some of the memories, and I got to know David extremely well. And you know that you introduced me serendipitously to Bud Hopkins, with whom I spent a good deal of time in the last 3 years of his life. So
yes,
I've had really up close contact with people who've seriously researched this subject and made great strides towards furthering our understanding of it. When I acknowledged, I should say, that I was an abductee, because you're either an abductee from birth or you're not. And the title of the book, as you have alluded to, is The Intergenerational Abduction Program Explored, because it is a program, and it does go down the generations, and there is a specific purpose for this, that the entities prosecuting this program do it that way. And what I'm trying to get at in this book is I get under the skin of exactly why they might be doing that, and I come at it from a number of different angles. And I think we really need to get to grips with a deeper level of understanding about this issue, because it's possible that as many as 400 million people in the world are subject to this. Yeah. And probably 95% of them are unaware of what's going on with them. But there is a very sound reasons why I quote that figure, which I explain at length in the book.
You do.
And 95% of people, maybe as many as 98 or 99% of abductees, are unaware that they're in this program. And that's how successful this covert operation is, but being prosecuted on the human race.
Steve, it's fair to say that you are representative of a certain archetype, particularly in the UK. You're well educated. You served in the military. You had a successful business career. You're well traveled. You're well spoken. You have an appreciation for culture. I love your art collection, and you're well read, but kind of in terms of the life that you've been living, the title of one of Dr. Jacobs' books sums it up: A Secret Life. This is not a subject that, with the exception of a tiny handful of people, including those you've just mentioned, and your mother and your grandmother, that you ever discussed. It was always kept out of it, and with good cause, the ridicule factor and all. Can you tell us when you first became aware that something was going on with you as a boy, and how you tried to address it or understand it at first?
Sure. Well, I always had these nighttime experiences as a child, maybe every few weeks. It's very difficult to put a number on it. I would say a minimum of 3 or 4 times a year, but it could be as many more times than that, where I was not asleep and I knew I was awake, and nothing, I couldn't move anything in my body. And I was surrounded by these little creatures, and I was aware of being levitated and lifted, and I couldn't see what was happening. And then
keep going. Continue.
Well, that's a
on.
loud bell. At some point, when I was probably 13 or 14, these experiences seem to stop. But what happens is that the phenomenon shifts somehow, and you experience it in different ways after that. It's very difficult to talk about. I was aware that these creatures that were interacting with me were intelligent, sentient beings, and very, very physical. Whatever was going on with me was very physical. It wasn't something mysterious or, woo, if you like. It was very, very physical. I was being manipulated and probed and so forth. And I remember asking one of these entities when I was maybe 10 or 11 years old, why this was going on, why they were doing this to me. And he said, they have this very bored sounding, offhand, sort of matter-of-fact way of talking to you, if they talk to you in your mind, telepathically, which is another subject completely. He said to me, it's because of your mother and your grandmother and your great-grandmother. And he just carried on with what he was doing. And I never forgot that somehow. I mean, I did for a long periods of time. It wasn't at the forefront of my mind, but I always remembered it. And I remember asking my grandmother at age 11 about these abduction events. I didn't call them abductions. And she just said to me, she was a largely uneducated or a very, very basic primary education. And she was a tenant farmer's daughter in West Yorkshire, and in the first half of the 20th century. So she wasn't particularly clued into anything, really. She didn't read much, and she didn't have any scientific education at all. And she said, oh, they're the pixies, Stevie. They're the pixies. Don't worry, they'll always bring you back. So she knew what was going on with this phenomenon, but she had a different way of framing it, of explaining it to herself in terms of the current folklore of the environment she grew up in. That they were pixies, and there was the fairy thing, the Magonia stuff. She explained it in those terms. Yeah. And I suspect many abductees who actually became aware of what was going on with them in some ways during the first half of the 20th century actually put it within that framework. They didn't know anything about extraterrestrials. They didn't know anything about cosmology or the possibility of life on other planets. It wasn't really seriously talked about or seriously written about. So that's the way it was framed to her. And so that's until I was 16 or so. That's the framework I carried around with me. The Magonia stuff, the pixies, the fairies, the fairy world, the folklore. I thought that was that's just something that happens to some kids in their lives, Yeah.
We'll come back to what happened when you were 16, but do you remember the first time you discussed this subject with your mother?
Yeah, she discussed it with me, to be very precise. I was maybe between 16 and 18, and she kept talking to me about them, these people, these creatures that were interfering with us. And she said, she said, I know exactly who's involved in it. It's my mum, that's my grandmother. And she said, it's me and it's you. And I don't think anyone else in the family is involved in this at all. Now, she may have been right or wrong about that, but that was a very strong feeling she had. And she complained these entities interfered with her in so many ways. I go into these in the book in some detail, and she couldn't make sense of it. She framed it within the spiritualism, the spiritual experience that she was. She took me to see crystal ball gazers and mediums and so forth when I was in my teenage years, on weekends and stuff. And she had all this whole occult spiritual explanation for it. That's how she framed it. And I never once heard her talk about aliens or extraterrestrials or abductions in those terms. She had something was going on with her, something was interfering with her, something was talking to her, dealing with her, and that's how she framed it.
What happened when you were 16?
Right. This forms the prologue of Out of Time, because it was such a significant event. I was working at an agricultural nursery for the summer between between school and higher education college. You know, the summer vacation is 8 weeks or so. Yeah. And I was working away for 6 days a week at the agricultural nursery. The day I had off was Saturday. That's the only day I didn't go to work, because we got really double money on Sunday, and we were obliged to work the other 5 days to get the double money. But the Saturday I just took off. And I remember on the 20th of July, 1972, I had a very, very strong inclination for some reason, very strong urge suddenly, that on a Saturday morning, 2 days hence, I was to get up and go somewhere. And this may sound it sounds strange to me now, but to me at the time, it was like a really deep compulsion. And I knew that I just had to do this. I didn't really think about it. So on the Saturday morning, which I normally used to sleep in, because, you know, I started work very early in the morning in the nursery. I started work at 8 and had to leave at 7:15 or so. On the Saturday morning, I just got up out of bed at 5 o'clock, bright as a button, and put my clothes on and went straight out the house. And I just walked about a mile, maybe a mile and a half, to this place that I knew I just felt compelled to go to. And I remember getting there, and it was like a building site. They were building some new houses there, and there were no residents in those houses at the time. That they were all being constructed, and maybe it's 400 meters or so to the nearest inhabited dwelling. So it's kind of a little bit isolated, although we lived in a suburban middle-class neighborhood which bordered on a rural part of the country. And I remember getting there and thinking, okay, what now? And suddenly everything changed. I suddenly looked at my watch, and it was from being 5:45, which is when I looked at my watch a moment before, it was 5 minutes past 8. And the air was full of blue and green and purple and indigo spectral lights, and a whooshing sound in my ears. And I felt completely disorientated, and I thought, what the hell is going on? Have I been unconscious for 2 hours or what? And I looked through an aperture in the wall of this newly built house, which was half completed. And through the rectangular aperture where the window was yet to be fitted, I saw a flying saucer drifting from left to right about 100 meters away. It was about 30 meters off the ground. I could see all the detail of it. It was very, very big, and it was just drifting across my field of vision. And I had this missing time, this flying saucer, full-on visual sighting right in front of me, and this whooshing sound and these spectral lights all around me, and suddenly, bang! I just was back to normal, and it was all gone, and the UFO was disappeared, and the spectral lights are gone. And I remember looking at my watch and thinking, it's nearly 10 past 8. Where the hell have I been? What's been going on? And I felt a wet sensation, a hot, wet sensation on my cheek. And I got home and there's a perfectly round burn mark on the cheek, the size of a large coin. And it kept weeping. And after about 24 hours or so, it scabbed over and became hard and scaly. So I had this physical effect on my body, which lasted about 3 months. And after that, life was never the same. I knew that this was something that happened that I could never really pretend didn't happen. But in 1972, in suburban middle-class Northwest England, I had no frame of reference at all. This is years before the internet. The abduction phenomenon wasn't even known about, and it wasn't even in the public domain in the UK at all in any way. And I had no idea of what to make of it. I could make no sense of it. And I pushed it to the back of my mind and thought, well, I've got other things to get on with in life. That's just one of those weird things. Maybe it's one of those weird things like my mother has experienced. And I didn't couch it in the terms that my mother and grandmother did, who each had their particular frame of reference that they put on it, depending on their life experience, and the way they view the world. But I just could make no sense of it. And I kept thinking about it for years. And occasionally, about 3 or 4 times a year, I'd come back to it and think, what the hell was that? And surprisingly, when I first heard about the alien abduction phenomenon, maybe it was in the 1980s or 90s, I actually didn't somehow connect it to this thing that had gone on years before. I don't know why. People don't, abductees don't, when they have these experiences, they often don't add them up, and there is a way that the abductors have got of making you confuse things, forget things. They push it into your long-term memory, and there's a reason they do this. And this is also one of the main themes of Out of Time, the reasons why they do this and what they're involved in doing.
Steve,
sorry to say.
Yeah, exactly. As time progressed, you consistently resisted the impulse, the desire, the possibility to share this with a colleague, a friend, a woman you were involved with, a business associate. It simply stayed below the surface. Is that correct?
Yeah, there were abductees have other things happen to them all the time, and I had those other things. I had sensations of being lifted up and flying at night. I've had extremely vivid dreams of playing with little children. I've had another flying saucer sighting in 1976 on a beach in the middle of the summer, in the middle of the night. That's a very strange incident that I go into a fair bit in Out of Time. And 2 other UFO sightings that I remember, and a number of other things. I saw a mutilated cow in County Kerry in Ireland in the summer of 1970, really close up, because I was taken to see this mutilated cow by the son of the farmer we were staying with, and he took only me to see this, and he ignored everyone else, and he didn't take my sister or either of my parents or any other guests. And I remember being shocked by this mutilated cow that had its backside, its sexual organs carved out and its udders partly removed and its jawbone half eaten away. And he said the vet had just been to see this dead cow, and the vet had announced that it was anthrax that had killed it. You and I know that's obviously nonsense, but that's what they were told. And being simple farmers in rural Ireland in 1970, that's what they believed. That's what they believed, what they were told to believe. But it was years and years until I discovered this cattle mutilation phenomenon was a thing. And other people had, people like Linda Moulton Howe, who did extremely good work uncovering it in the 1980s, had brought it to international attention. And I finally realized, oh yeah, that cow I saw in Kerry, that's one of those. It looked exactly like those. And the circumstances were exactly like those circumstances. So there were incidents like that through the years, but I didn't really connect them all up. I was just I was just a person that weird things happened to, you know.
Is it fair to say that up until this point in your life, you had never read a UFO book, looked at a UFO magazine, watched a UFO related documentary?
Well, I bought a magazine in 1967 when I was 11 years old.
That magazine, yes. Let's talk about that.
It was an American magazine for sale in a British newsagent, and they had one copy. They just got one copy. Probably the distributor said, "You want one of these?" And he said, the newsagent said, "Oh yeah, okay, then stick it up there with the Marvel comics and stuff, you know."
Top shelf.
Well, I bought it because I just looked at the cover of this thing. I was, 11 years old, and I just couldn't take my eyes off it. And it's something about that subject was really deeply inside. I knew it was important to me somehow. It's very difficult to explain. And it was written by Brad Steiger, and you can still find references to on the internet, and still very occasionally you can find copies of it for sale on eBay at extortionate prices if they're in good condition, because it's very rare now. And The Flying Saucer Menace. And in that magazine, among its 80 to 100 pages or so, and it was a fairly well-produced, classy piece of work, there was about 6 lines of text about the abduction phenomenon. And the Betty and Barney Hill case was described in a couple of lines, and the Antonio Villas-Boas case was mentioned, and there was the Valencel case in the French Alps, and that was it basically. And then he moved on to a different subject, which was invariably photographs and film of UFOs and sightings. That's what the weight of the publication was about, because the weight of the whole phenomenon, the investigative center of gravity of the phenomenon in the 1960s was not abductions. That was just some weird thing on the fringe that some people thought, that reported happened to them, and they were probably psychotic or something, and didn't remember things properly or whatever. It was just dismissed out of hand.
You're absolutely right. And to just expand on that for a moment, when I became involved in being obsessed with this subject overnight, and began to get a basic education, I kind of entered the field not knowing there was something called ufology, that there were magazines and conferences. I assumed there'd be books on it. I knew no one who was interested, involved, or in any way caught up in this subject. So it was, like you, a very personal exploration. But
can you remind me when that was, Peter?
It started in 1975. And the first year, I really was very tenuous for my sister and I to meet any other people, because I knew we weren't crazy. And Helen had, without prompting, verified my memory of the sighting that led to her first remembered abduction. And what I understood within a few years, as I started to make contact with future colleagues, was that in the mid-1970s and beyond that, the world of people that were doing this work, primarily middle-aged white guys, which I guess still dominate the field, was their primary concern was to be taken seriously in what we'll laughingly call the adult world. And radar returns, declassified documents, analysis of organic material that had allegedly come in contact with something truly phenomenological was acceptable enough. But as David Jacobs said, and of course Dave has a very dry sense of humor, we were concentrated on the cars and not the drivers. Because to talk about the drivers, that sounds loopy. The cars, sure, hypothetically, I'm open-minded. I can think about and talk about this. For you, when did you interface with your first UFO book and start to
that would have been, I think that was probably there were two books. I can't remember which one I read first. One was Timothy Good's Top Secrets, and the other was Whitley Strieber's Communion, and they were both appeared on the UK market in 1987, and they were both very, very well promoted in the mainstream on primetime chat shows and so forth by the respective authors on the radio show and so forth. And I can't remember which one I read first, but the Tim Good Above Top Secret book I thought was absolutely fantastic. He was so thorough and so meticulous in his analysis, and he got the documents from the Freedom of Information Act out of the NSA and all the Department of Defense.
All of the individuals he references, all of the extraordinary research Tim did. And in fact, both of those books were published in 1987, only months apart. In terms of hard information from a good establishment source, I don't think you could have done better than start with Above Top Secret. And as far as anecdotal human experience, Whitley, of course, was a professional and very successful writer by that time, and put his heart into capturing that account. As you know, I was working as Bud Hopkins' assistant at that time, and had the unusual privilege of having Whitley Strieber, who I'd never met or spoken with, cold call me shortly before the book went to press to ask me to read the manuscript, not to proof it, it had already been professionally proofed, but to give him my honest thoughts and impressions on the content and any suggestions I might have. And once you read those two books, where did you go from there in your thoughts or with your actions?
Well, with Communion, Strieber got quite a lot of skepticism and pushback in the UK, probably in the United States as well.
Yes.
But to me, he came across as somebody who was genuinely highly intelligent, genuinely troubled by something that was happening to him. Indeed. And it wasn't just one incident; it was one after another. Yeah. And the artistic image on the cover, painted up by someone called Seth Jacobs, I think it's Seth Jacobs.
An illustrator who Bud actually found for him.
Really? Wow. It was so that image is so arresting. People, friends of mine who read the book, because a lot of people were talking about it, couldn't have it on the bedside table. They put it down with its front cover downwards, and that was a very common reaction to it. And I was just wondered now in the later years whether so many of these people were abductees and couldn't cope with it. Couldn't cope with it staring out at them.
Not out of the question. And I will tell you that Bud received several hundred letters. I know because I responded to many of them and opened many of them. Whitley probably received over the next few years several thousand letters from readers around the world, because that book became, of course, a smash international bestseller, saying, to one degree or another, "Dear Mr. Strieber, I saw your book, picked it up, something about the image, etc." But literally no one wrote Bud or Whitley to say, "That's the being that I saw by my bed." Anybody that referred to it it looked sort of like that, but it didn't have the pointy chin, didn't have the pronounced nose, the mouth was smaller, the eyes were at this angle. Everybody literally wrote to make the corrections, bringing it much more back to the archetypical gray, which in itself I found fascinating.
Interesting, yeah. But the image resonated with them. These experiences, if you like, abductees obviously recognized that whoever painted it or whoever had given instructions to the painter actually knew what they looked like, but the interpretation was a little bit off. But Bud Hopkins was mentioned in Strieber's book. As you know,
it's dedicated to him.
Yes, and in the UK in the 1980s, nobody knew about Bud Hopkins. Nobody knew who he was.
Sure.
At least if you were like working with Bufora or a UFO, immersed in a UFO subject or study subject, you probably
would have heard. Yeah.
But the majority of people in the UK knew absolutely nothing about this. And that was the first time I heard Bud Hopkins's name, came across Bud Hopkins's name. And an artist in New York, which sounded very improbable that he would be investigating flying saucers, UFO abductions. But Intruders was published concurrently with Communion, wasn't it? The same year, maybe.
And Intruders, yes, exactly the same year as well.
Yeah. So I came across the name of Hopkins, but again, I took no action. I didn't really get drawn into the subject for a long time after that. And then,
at a certain point, however, 87, there's this kind of opening, and certain reference markers, stay with you. Your experiences continue to happen. And then at a certain point, you make another really life-changing decision, which is begin to actively explore these experiences, still completely under the radar in your private life. And it's fair to say that over the next years, you allotted a considerable amount of money to discreetly come and go from the United States and to find the people that you wanted to make contact with in the UK. It's one thing to, I've had these experiences, I'm going to write about them, I'm going to think about them, I'm going to take them seriously. It's another thing to say, I'm going to earmark a part of, my income to discreetly meet these people, to go to Snowflake, Arizona and meet Travis Walton, to go and meet Linda Howe, to go to the United States and make contact with David Jacobs, to meet this person. Ultimately, of course, you became very good friends with Timothy Good, and we had some wonderful times in London together. And as you know, you spent time with Nick Pope. You seek these people out, and you began to methodically basically organize these things in your mind. And at a certain point, you were going to conferences. You were, we met 15 years ago at a very particular, terrific one-off conference in Atlantic City, New Jersey. And the next thing I knew, we were not just friendly acquaintances, we were friends. And you were not just somebody that I was getting together with in New York City. You rented a car and you came up here. And you and Janice stayed with me and my father for a while. And of course, I started to stay with you two in your lovely home just outside of London at the time. And what do you remember essentially that point where you decided to make that commitment and go through the process, which could be awkward or even seeming intrusive to that person of, hi, I'm this person and I'm seeking you out. I'd like to speak to you. Do you remember how that line got crossed?
Well, excuse me. Again, I think it's like a kettle boiling. It at some point it boils over, and you just have to do something. I wanted to engage with the subject, and I wanted to find out real, seriously concrete, reliable information about it. And Nick Pope appeared on, at the time he was working for the MOD in the UK. And he was, nevertheless, he'd written a couple of books on, open skies, closed minds, and his book on the abduction phenomenon, The Uninvited. And he was appearing on as a talking head on Discovery Channel and History Channel late night documentaries, and he was popping up all over the place because he's extremely media friendly. So I'd seen him, I knew the name, and I've seen him, on TV a number of times. So I looked him up on the internet and found that he had an email address, and I wrote to him. And surprisingly, I didn't expect to get a reply. Surprisingly, he responded to me, and I subsequently met him. in Yorkshire, where he was speaking at a conference, and he linked me up with a hypnotist to try and, because I want to try and recover some memories, because your memories are very sketchy, if at all,
Sure.
because the abductors suppress the memories. And Nick basically took me under his wing for a while, and we met up in London a number of times and became quite close. And Tim Good often joined us.
Good.
Tim invited Janice and me down to his house in Kent for the weekend once, and we subsequently the three of us met up a number of times. And
Yes.
I kind of slowly got plugged into people in the United States as well. And I know you were working with Bud Hopkins, and you knew him very well. Bud was, because I'd read Missing Time in 2007, and Intruders, I actually wanted to meet Hopkins very badly. And that's the reason I went to that Atlantic City conference, because I didn't know who Richard Dolan was, and Dolan was there too. And I didn't know, who yourself and your excellent work over the years. I just didn't know anybody, but I had this book by Hopkins, and he was billed to speak at that conference. And I went to Atlantic City, New Jersey from Hertfordshire, and rented a car and traveled down there to meet Hopkins, who unfortunately didn't appear,
Wasn't able to
at the
do
conference,
that
because he was quite seriously ill at the time. And I didn't really understand his health situation.
Yes.
He was quite poorly and he couldn't attend. But
right.
I linked up with you, and by a number of surreptitious things that joined end to end, you actually got me to meet him in the end of 2008. So that's basically the story. And the best work on the abduction phenomenon has come out of the United States. The most prominent people who've made big strides in our understanding of this phenomenon have all been in the United States. And there's a couple in Europe here and there, but they haven't really had the breakthroughs in understanding that people like Hopkins and Jacobs and Mack, and a number of other people like Ray Fowler and Carla Turner, Barbara Bartholik, all these people who had studied the phenomenon and made it a serious commitment to research it, and had gained a certain amount of public profile. And they were all in America, and I lived across the Atlantic, so I had to go to America to find these people and talk to them about the subject.
Well, I, for one, am very glad that you had a career that you worked very hard at and ultimately had your own business involved in, that you were able to basically have earnings that allowed you this discretionary spending. You were coming and going very regularly, like a commuter for years.
Yeah, I was. I had 11 trips, and some of them were for quite long duration. And I was very fortunate in that my business was very successful. I started a surgical innovations company, and I was very successful at it, and made good money. I wouldn't say millions, but good money. And I was able to do these things, and I was my own boss, and I was able to, indulge is the wrong word, but I was able to spend what needed to be spent and carved out the time that needed to be carved out of my diary to pursue this issue during those years. And not everyone is in anything like as fortunate a position as I was to be able to do it.
For what it's worth, just as a human observation, once we became close, you and Janice have been good and true and dear friends for years. And with the extremely weighty seriousness and the implications of the subject that brought us together, at no point have you lost your ability to enjoy. We have had so much fun over the years in various adventures together here and in the UK.
Yeah.
It just reminds me for the thousandth time that although from my point of view, this is an absolutely god-awful way to attempt to make a living. You really have to be
Yeah.
certifiable, and I am. But the perks on the job can be absolutely breathtaking, and it begins with the people, if you're fortunate, that you
Yeah.
become friendly with and become part of your life. Occasionally, sometimes the places you go, even in a more modest way. Just this past weekend for me, being back in beautiful Exeter, New Hampshire. Not that we ever steal place names from you in the UK, but in New England and Exeter and New Hampshire, it was just that kind of thing, reconnecting with people who are drawn very closely together by this subject. We have about 5 minutes, 6 minutes or so before we go to break, and then return with our other guests. Any thoughts that you'd like to add at this time, or in summation, or just introduce as we move into our second hour?
Anything I'd like to add? Well, the big understandings came later, well, especially the time I spent working with David Jacobs and the time I spent with Bud Hopkins and a number of other people. They're the main two. Before Bud passed over in August 2011, yeah. I stayed with him in Manhattan several times, and Leslie was generous enough to offer me her apartment whenever she went away filming, to Europe and so forth. She just lent me her apartment so I could stay there, not being Bud's way, but could keep an eye on him and could deal with him every day. So that was. Now, I've started. There's something in the book where a part of the book where I talk about what these beings are, because people describe the Greys, little guys that fetch and carry and fetch their abductees from their environments and take them back again. And the big Greys, they're not really that tall, but they're twice as tall as the smaller ones, that carry out fairly complicated procedures, like a lot of the physiological examinations and the mind scan operations are done by those Greys. Okay. And people, these are now the aliens in popular culture. The bug-eyed alien, with big almond-shaped eyes and the skinny body and so forth. So as a chapter in which I go into what are they and why do abductees describe mainly dealing with them, but they also describe dealing with other creatures, and why is that, and what are all these others about? So there's a chapter of the book where I examine all this, and where the true originators of the abduction program, the people who are responsible for the abduction program, are not these guys, not the Greys. They're another type of being completely. So that's something I came to later on, partly because of my remembered experiences and piecing it all together, and partly because a lot of dialogues I had with Dave Jacobs and a couple of other people where we kind of worked it out. It's very complicated to go into in an hours-long interview, but if people read the book, they will discover what I think about that. And there's a whole thing about people describing reptilian-like beings. There's a lot of things on the internet about reptilians, but I think that those reptilians are a very, very specific thing. And that's how they find their way into this popular culture, into this mythos. And they've probably been with us for a long time, on and off. But they're a very specific thing, and understanding exactly what they are takes a good deal of study and investigation for you to come to that. And, you introduced me to Farah Yurderzu. Well, I actually met her at the Atlantic City Conference as well.
Yeah.
But she has a story in one of her books from a great-grandfather who had recounted something that happened to him in the 1890s, which is extremely pertinent to the central thesis of Out of Time as to how this program originated and what this program is really about. And Farah didn't actually realize the importance of this encounter, but I tie it into other things and in the book. And if people would read that section, they would probably take something valuable away from it. Hopefully.
Steve, when can we expect the book to be published and available?
Well, I've got the preprint copy here.
Wow.
It says not for resale on the front. It's 330 pages, including the front matter. It's about to be published. It will probably be, we're pre-recording this. It will probably be published by the 12th of September, which is when, broadcast is planned for this episode. So either then or very, very shortly after that.
And I'm going to ask you to, I'm going to ask you to hold that thought. The website is outoftimebook.info/. This is Peter Robbins with my special guest, Steve Aspin. This is the cover of the book, and we'll be back in 4 minutes.
Hey members, the new KGRA DB app is now available on iOS and Android devices. Gain on-demand access to any KGRA DB programming. Download any show directly to your mobile device to listen or watch on the go. Go to the App Store and search KGRA DB.
Are we alone in the universe? The most important question facing humanity is on the verge of being settled once and for all. The Mutual UFO Network has been at the forefront of this journey for nearly 50 years. Our members worldwide are dedicated to the research, documentation, and awareness that will shape the future of humanity. Won't you join us?
Discover the Observation Deck, a one-of-a-kind virtual event platform that takes video conferencing to the next level by using avatars to navigate a campus. There's so many areas and activities to choose from. There's a 1,000-seat auditorium, an expo hall, a nightclub, and even a beach. So come attend a conference, take a class, or hear a lecture on the incredible Observation Deck campus. Go to theobservationdk.com.
You're listening to the KGRA Digital Broadcasting Network. We provide unparalleled coverage of trending news in the world of ufology, cryptozoology, and paranormal phenomenon. Whether you're watching our video live stream or listening to one of our audio programs, you are getting the best from world-renowned researchers and hosts, guiding you through topics the mainstream won't touch. Miss one of your favorite programs? No problem. Head over to the members area at kgradb.com for access to our massive library of award-winning content. Make contact, stay connected. Only at kgradb.com.
Hello, and welcome back to this special broadcast of Meanwhile Here on Earth with my guest for the first hour, Steve Aspin. If you're just joining us, the subject of today's program is a new book about to be published right now on or about September 12th, which I very strongly feel has the potential of being the most influential and significant book on the abduction phenomena since the 1987 publication of Whitley Strieber's Communion. And I don't necessarily mean that in terms of zillions of copies sold. Whitley, at the time of the writing, was already a very successful fiction writer, a novelist, as many of us know. But this book is, it has really rocked my world to a degree. And with Steve's permission, several weeks back, I contacted two very good friends and esteemed and trusted colleagues, and with Steve's permission, forwarded them copies of the manuscript to read and then to join us on this show to discuss their feelings about it and questions they might have for Steve. The first is Earl Grey Anderson. Earl is MUFON State Director for Southern California and is an active member of MUFON's ERT, which is the Experiencers Research Team, and hosts both Experiencer workshops and at this year's past symposium did just that in Colorado. Earl has personally investigated over 800 separate UFO reports and specializes in experiencer high strangeness cases. He has appeared on multiple radio shows, podcast TV shows such as The Unidentified with Demi Lovato, the Travel Channel Storming Area 51 special, and the season finale of Motor Trend Television's Motor Mythbusters. Don't say that fast 3 times. Cars versus UFOs. Earl teaches an accredited course on ufology at Los Angeles's Otis College of Art and Design, and that's a very compressed introduction. Our second guest joining us now is my friend Chris Evers. Chris is the editor and producer of the outstanding online monthly publication, Outer Limits Magazine. He is also the organizer of the very popular and, I must say, terrific yearly conference, the Outer Limits Magazine UFO Conference, held annually in Hull, England. He is a professional photographer, a husband, a father, a brother, a major spokesperson, and really a rock-solid, responsible individual in the world of UFO studies in the UK. And it is my pleasure to welcome you guys to the show. Chris and Earl, welcome and welcome back to Meanwhile Here on Earth.
Hi, Peter.
Here, Peter. Thank you.
You're most welcome. So I sent you a copy of a book, and let's have this guy join us again. And we haven't spoken since then. Earl, I know both of you actually have lives outside of this and rather busy ones. We're not able to read every word of the 300 plus pages, but both of you read most of the manuscript. Earl, can you give us an idea of your impression?
I love the book. The mix between Steve's personal account, which is in some ways, sort of a proverbial long time abduction scenario. And we find out that it's generational, which it often usually is. Occasionally you'll have a one-off case and that does happen, but it's usually generational. And but just the historical content of the book is wonderful. I wish that I could have met Bud Hopkins. I was a kind of a late comer to this field. Although I'm happy to tell you, Steve, that the people are taking the spot, the place that was left by John Mack and Bud and the now retired David Jacobs. I'm a member of the Experiencer Resource Team over at MUFON, and this is what I do every single day. I retired from a nursing career a couple of years ago, and I've just kind of thrown myself into investigating mostly the abduction and visitation phenomenon And as well as, the ERT stands for the Experiencer Resource Team. It used to be the research team, but we found that we were being more like social workers, and getting people to support groups, or if people had a burning desire to be hypnotically regressed, we'll lead them in that direction. But just the history that's in your book is wonderful, and I'm almost all the way through. I finally had to put it down about 1 a.m. Last night, or this morning, I guess technically. But I just have one chapter left to go. It's a brilliant book, and I think it's going to go very far. Also, my friend and colleague, Dr. Don DeRee, wrote the foreword to your book.
Yes, he did. And Chris, I'm going to ask you the same question, basically what your impression upon first reading of the parts of the manuscript you read, but also with the understanding that this is a first in terms of UK UFO related book publishing. There has never been a book quite like this in the UK, and more for you than for the rest of us. Steve does represent a certain English archetype, in terms of class, education, service, business. What were your thoughts upon reading the book?
Well, my first impressions of the book was that it is well presented, well investigated. It's, in some respects, and I don't mean this to sound negative, it's a potted history of the subject, in that it talks of the Betty and Barney Hill case. It talks about the Pascagoula case, Calvin Parker, Charles Hickson, 1973, and it does bring us up to Steve's own personal story. The book itself is extremely well presented. I'm very, very well impressed with it. Well done, Steve.
Thank you, Chris.
You are, in the demi-world of UFO book history. You are the first two individuals to be commenting on this book publicly on the airwaves, in a conference, in any place, except for my brief introduction. How do you think this book will be received for the audience intended? And again, Steve was very deliberate in writing it obviously for people like us, but less so than your every man and every woman. And my impression is that it will be at first an underground success, and then a book that has a potential of real crossover into mainstream reading, much as, say, Leslie Kane's fine book on UFOs, government officials, pilots, generals, etc., had in the States. Your thoughts on that, Earl? First.
I think that it's going to open doors up. I plan on recommending it to people, and there are only so many books I recommend. I recommend Kathleen Marden and Denise Stoner's book on the subject. There's Kathleen's book, What to Do If You've Been Abducted. Yeah. Of course, Bud's books and John Mack. I've always felt a great connection and propensity for John's work. I think I probably fall into his school probably most closely to any of these schools, but I think that you do have a crossover potential there, Steve. It's a wonderfully and eloquently written book. And but it, what I found was really great about it, that it doesn't talk down to its audience. It doesn't, it doesn't, like, I'm not sure, mansplain or explain it, overly pedantically. It's just a pleasure to read, and you're drawn into it. And if you've had any of these experiences, and I have had my wife and I did have a strange experience. You're immediately connecting with Steve's narrative, and it becomes personal. So I think it's a fabulous book, and I plan on putting it on my list of books to recommend to experiencers that come to me and that I meet.
Chris,
very, very good.
My own opinion of the
yeah.
publication is that even though we know Steve is well educated, this could be written for royalty. It could be written for the average man in the street or the average woman.
Yeah.
It is something that I believe that everybody who is interested in the subject, whether deeply interested as perhaps we four are, or it's somebody who's just coming into the subject, the need to get their hands on this as soon as possible.
Yeah. You've just said something that I was trying to articulate and wasn't able to. Had Steve wanted to, he could have written the book in the same manner, but in a sense talking down to people. But he has gone out of his way to be as egalitarian as he can. And one of the things about being touched by this phenomenon is it blasts away a lot of human superficiality. And you are left either, if it didn't happen to you, intellectually appreciating, or if it did happen to you, absolutely viscerally understanding and living how much more we human beings have in common than we have separating each other. And it makes the whole UFO disclosure issue politically loaded. It literally stands the potential of bashing nationalism and encouraging people simply by the fact that they are human to understand that they have more in common with each other than the false notions of borders separating us. And whether or not, to whatever degree that was conscious, Steve, I think it's going to greatly assist in this book, basically creating its own potential slow-growing firestorm. Word of mouth, I expect, will be really unique on this, especially in terms of people who would not pick up a UFO book. Your thoughts right now, Steve, on just some of the feedback, and maybe to complete any thoughts from the first part of the show.
Thanks, Peter. I can just mention that we've got the storm going on again, and my connection is poor here, so I'm only hearing some of what my fellow guests are saying.
Don't hesitate to ask any of us to repeat, because we know that you're in the middle of an electrical storm there.
I'm concerned as to whether I can be heard or not. So if I come across not clearly because the connection is poor, can you immediately let me know?
You're coming through absolutely 5 by 5.
Great. Well, what I was hoping to do without of time was write a crossover book where there are millions of people in the world who have heard about alien abduction once or twice and have maybe seen something on the Discovery Channel or the History Channel or whatever on TV, or seen something on the internet, and they think they know a little bit about it, and everybody knows the meme of the bug-eyed, bald, skinny alien and so forth. But I wanted to basically take these kind of people by the hand and say, this is what it's all about, and lead them from where I was, in my younger days, a journey from there to really getting to grips with what's going on, and step by step. And I come at the issue from various different angles through the book, and narrow it down and end up with a pretty good synthesis, I think. I mean, it may not be correct. I may be incorrect about much of this, but I'm inviting other people to engage with this, and between us, I'm sure we can understand this mystery a lot better than we do. And basically, people who are not UFO buffs, people who don't go to UFO conferences, people who don't read books on the subject, but just kind of know about it, would read out of time and engage with it and end up really having grounded information on it. Because if I can just say one more thing,
Please.
It was very important to me that the book illustrated the definite medical scientific things that are established about this phenomenon, like the bodily scarring. I had a scoop mark scar on my shoulder, which was biopsied at Manhattan Clinic by a dermopathologist. And there were some hairs found on our carpet after an abduction, which we had analyzed by a forensic laboratory in Chicago. And this whole analysis is written up in an appendix, and it's these and the bodily scarring, the photographs of bodily scarring, and the implants that the insert in people. I wanted to bring these into one place so that people could really see that this is a real physical medical phenomenon. It's scientific. It's actually happening. It's not some fantasy that people dream up. You can't shoot away with sleep paralysis or any of this nonsense. It's really physically happening to people. And that I gather this evidence together in part of the book, and it's a very formidable, I think, a very formidable body of work brought together where people can see what actually is going on.
I have a question for each of you. It's the same question, but I want to say first, as I began to read your manuscript and thinking about what I knew at that point about your life and your life choices, there came a moment when I recalled a very important phrase for me in the work of Dr. Wilhelm Reich, which his body of scientific discoveries has had a great deal with my becoming the person I became, which is evasion of the obvious. Sometimes certain answers are sitting so close right in front of you that we human beings who love to complexify and look deeper when we need not miss certain things that are right in front of our faces. And Steve, at a certain point, when you began to work professionally, you went into a business and then made a career of working in cutting edge medical supply and apparatus that links to me, in my mind, very closely to almost an unconscious way to address the questions that were going on below the surface of the life you're living.
Yeah, I always had a terror of medical procedures. And I used to, when I first entered the industry, I had to go into operating theatres and watch procedures, and I used to pass out. I used to get faint and pass out. I just couldn't stand the sight of it. And I had to make myself do this for some reason. I had to make myself confront it. And I made a career out of it and, slowly, engaged with it and slowly fought through it and mastered it, and ended up being extremely successful at designing this stuff and marketing it around the world. So I was driven by something that was at origin, I think, the abductors put in me, not deliberately, but they, by their interactions.
And the electric storm continues, and we will hope that lightning did not make a direct strike. No, it looks like Steve is still alive. This is good. Continue on.
Maybe I don't know. Did you get all that or not?
Just at the point you cut out, it made sense in terms of forcing yourself basically to persevere in this direction.
Yeah, but that's. So I'm kind of at home with medical pathology and hematology and so forth, and clinical chemistry and surgery of all kinds. Because I've been involved in it for 35 years. So I can read a scientific paper by Dr. John Miller, who that I quote in the book about he's analyzing what the aliens are doing when they implant things, particularly in the right at the top of the nasal pharynx in the cribriform plate next to the brain. What they're doing there, and what he thinks, what he knows of neurology and the physics and the biology of that part of the body, what they might be doing. And it's I find it fascinating that people like John Miller have actually worked with abductees and examined them and examined the biological science, and have come to certain conclusions about what they're actually doing. And so these very, very physically real medical parts of the phenomenon are something that Out of Time really, really concentrates on and brings home again and again. Because I think people are skeptical about the phenomenon being real. This is the kind of stuff they need to convince them.
I couldn't agree more.
There's a lot of it. There's a lot of it, if you look for it. But it's not gathered together in any place.
No, in fact, it's often, historically, it's often been edited out. I remember 2 instances over the years of working with Bud where there were, it was arranged that film would be shot in his studio on a special by public broadcasting. We had high hopes for that. And then some years later, the late and well-known and distinguished American newsman Peter Jennings did a special. And they were given full privy to, with the permission of the individuals, of course, to case files, including physical evidences, overnight scarification with totally cauterized wounds, scoop marks, implants, multiply witnessed events, generational evidence, and they simply chose not to include it. And that, for me, is a lie by omission, where you have not just built a good personal case, it's a insidiously good personal case, and will really be a challenge, not for skeptics, but for debunkers, those who are arrogant enough to know that such things can't be happening. The question I have for the three of you, and I'm going to begin with you, Steve, and then ask you, Chris, and then you, Earl. And it's right now, at this moment in the world of UFO studies and the really quite exciting potential changes, the actual changes, the kabuki theater going on at the edges, and the emotion that it brings up in people of different predispositions, is when we talk about these beings, some people refer to them as aliens. I never felt really comfortable with that term. Other intelligences, for me, we're talking about a segment of intelligences in part of the spectrum of explanations of UFO phenomena, with a separate whole area of more, and I would say the Jacques Vallée, Jean Keel field of study and explanations. But what it comes down to is some people feel that these intelligences, for lack of a better term, are either good or bad. That what they're doing is threatening and leading to some turnover in control or dystopian flip of the world, and all of a sudden they're here, or they're hybrid representatives, and the power shifts and Brave New World. Others feel that it is just the opposite. These are enlightened beings that mean us well, who are doing what they can without overtly making themselves known to everyone at once, which could just cause a potential meltdown of the social fabric, in trying to get us at least to stop our ongoing Neolithic activity of clubbing each other to death over where the line is drawn in the dirt, a major preoccupation of man for millennia. And I say man and not mankind because I don't see this as originating with women. I think we would have done a lot better had they been in positions of power through the evolution of this. Or we may be dealing with two phenomena in terms of good ones and
people
bad
in the UK
ones.
at the moment are saying, be careful what you wish for.
Right. Oh, and congratulations on your new prime minister. Exactly. the other thing is a lot of it just is simply our attitudes of, all I know is I was scared out of my mind and they frightened me, therefore they're bad, as opposed to, gee, if I was a biologist working with endangered mammals and I had just caught some poor little cute otter creature in a cage, not to harm it, but to examine it, give it an injection to keep it healthy, maybe spray a number on its side and put a radio collar on it, it might not appreciate my intentions. Steve, what do you feel after a lifetime of interactions with these beings in terms of their intentions toward you and by extension humanity, or their ultimate, without, if you don't want to, fully stating your conclusions here, but can you share with us some sense of how you perceive them in this respect?
I think that they think they're doing us a big favor. They talk about the change, they talk about the future as being fantastic. Everybody's going to be happy. Everybody's going to love it. Your society is going to be so much better, after this. So they believe they have. This is a very, very big subject, but I think to them they think they're doing us a really big favor. And I'm not sure that from our perspective as to how we view, human freedom and independent human action and so forth, we'd necessarily go along with that. Most of us would probably not necessarily go along with that. But who knows? Who knows what the future holds?
Chris, you've had plenty of time to think about this, and in your very central position, not just heading what amounts to a publishing concern, a conference organizer, and I completely neglected to mention, as of fairly recently, the head of a new broadcast network, and congratulations on that as well. What are your thoughts about that basic question of their intentions?
Well, I suppose we could say that's the $6 million question, really, isn't it? Steve brings up some very interesting points in the book. One of those is screen images. Now, it talks about screen images being projected into the brain, or real images directly in front, as though there's some kind of three-dimensional screen image that we're actually walking through or moving through or interacting with.
Yes.
How do we not know that, forgive me, the Space Brothers or the Coming to Get Us, how do we not know that isn't a screen image?
Good point. And the lightning has hit again. Earl, your thoughts on this question, and in your hot seat that you are in this very privileged central position in what amounts to the largest UFO research organization in the world. I'm guessing that you get input and feedback supporting or attacking both of these views, and it's very emotional to many people, understandably. And I think you'd have to agree with me, certainly in the States, we're seeing an increasing schism between those people who feel that it's a potential blessing for humanity, and we need to get ourselves together to evolve to the point where they will be willing to, make contact with us in a more open and beneficial way, and those who are extremely cautious of it. And all we need to do is look at, quote unquote, the government and their behavior, despite what their words are. First, it's always a matter of national insecurity. I would posit that it's a game with words, and what we've been talking about since 1947 is national insecurity and a fear of the unknown and losing control and being seen for what we are, as creatures that are not dominant, creatures that are not in control. beings in a society that are woefully behind than other sentient beings in the cosmos or in other dimensions. What are your basic thoughts on this, especially as they impact on what you've read about Steve's personal account and the book that he has written?
Well, I think that for officialdom, for the military and those, you know, who get our tax dollars to practice and all that, that it's always going to be threat assessment. They're always going to be looking with that view. We pay them to do that, actually, and they're kind of doing their job. Yeah. But if that's the only side that we see to this, it's kind of an unbalanced view. But I understand the importance of that. I think that motives run the gamut with our visitors. I don't think that all, you know, even though they may look the same, it's like what Chris was saying. We don't know how much is being projected into our minds, even as far as what they look like.
That's
you know,
right.
I mean, is every intelligence in the universe bipedal with a head and two arms? I doubt very, very seriously. I think that some of the DNA farming that we saw that was so prevalent back in the 80s and the 90s and even the early 2000s, some of that was going for the hybridization program, which is one thing that was going on by one group. I think there's another group that they were thinking about creating avatars, because I think that some of the intelligences do walk among us, but sometimes in temporary bodies that they can inhabit and that they can create and almost like in the film Avatar. And it's a way that they can communicate and deal with us in a personal basis. But yet perhaps they're doing it remotely somehow. You know, I know that the mantis type creatures, most people see them in orbit. They don't see them in gravity. I don't think that the way that they're constructed, they're kind of spindly. I don't think they could take their own weight in Earth gravity. I know that they have ways around gravity that they can float things, but it may be, you know, that's the reason why people usually see them on a craft and not in their rooms and such. But I think that different things are going on. I think there's different motives that are out there. We see a lot less DNA farming now and more stuff where people are visited and getting downloads. Or, you know, I had a police officer was abducted from his cruiser while on duty. He had to explain this to his, chief.
Gosh.
Yeah, they, you know, he became the butt of their jokes, you know, leave it to you to get abducted on duty. But this guy was getting nightly downloads where he feels like he was being taught things about 0 point energy that's going to come back. This is what he was told after a month. It'll come back when it's needed. And then it stopped and it all went away. And he, you know, I haven't heard from him. I know that I wound up giving him contacts with the people that might be able to hypnotically regress him. He was hoping to be able to tap back into that because he was a D- math student, by the way, and suddenly he's understanding high mathematics, and he was amazed and astounded by it. But I think it's the ontological shock that scares us right up front. Sometimes the fear stays because they maybe have met some of the carpetbaggers or DNA thieves that are out there. There's robbers in every society. There are robber barons and there are robbers and those that'll steal you blind, you know, pickpockets. If you get out in Paris, France, and you're in the wrong place, you'll lose everything if you keep your wallet in your back pocket. And I think it's the same thing cosmically. So I don't think they're all space brothers, but I don't think they're all demons, you know, trying to steal our souls either, or trying to take us over. If they're trying to take us over, they're doing a pretty bad job of it. They've had a long time to do it, you know, and we're still mostly fighting amongst ourselves and living out the human soap opera down here. So that's my feeling on it.
You remind me, Earl, something used to come up in regular discussion with Bud was first at a certain point, after so many similar scenarios and cases and similar memories, and even to the word, similar descriptions, that this idea of screen memories and their ability to affect our perception I accept that wholeheartedly. Perhaps there's a certain compassion to it of, if you saw what I really looked like, you would freak out. And so I appear in a more benign way, and the origin of the 4-foot high white owl that the great Mike Cleland so wonderfully documents among so many abductees in his books on the subject, and a third book that, as he said, wrote itself, of people contacting him after his first 2 books with their increased descriptions of white owl phenomena. The other is the selectivity of our human mind that has, in an allegorical sense, a shutoff switch as far as I'm concerned. If I'm looking at something, and it can be a conventional trauma, they're all too often, and tragic one, and I cannot handle what I'm seeing, I will either blank it out, misremember it, or remember it in a completely different complexion until I'm able to deal with it. Steve, please remind us, in the experiences that you've had, the interactions that you've had, the visitations that you've had from childhood on, has it always been in the form of the ubiquitous gray, or have you interfaced with other entities or other appearing entities in that time to your memory?
I deliberately make the case in the introduction of the book that I don't include in the narrative, in the core narrative, experiences that were uncovered with hypnosis. And there's a reason why I do this. There's basically 2 reasons why I do this. But so the experiences that I relate in the main narrative in chapter 1, which is like 30 pages, are recounted from normal memory and things that I went through in the 50 years before I, started investigating the phenomenon seriously. But things that I remembered when I began to bury into the long-term memory, and there's a number of interactions with what a German abductee I know really, really well, always describes me as the human-looking ones, because she doesn't know about literature. She's never read a book on abductions. She doesn't know about alien-human hybrids. She just calls them the human-looking ones, and they do this to her and they do that to her. And they are by far the dominant prosecutors of the program in recent years. And I've come up against those a lot in the last 10 years.
Chris, at this point, do you have any really specific questions for Steve about anything that we've discussed, or anything else in your battery of knowledge about the subject and what he is about to add to it publicly with the publication of this book?
Yeah, Steve, you mentioned, and the whole point of the book as well is about it being intergenerational. Do you have children? Do anything like this happen to your children?
No, I don't have any. It's not for want of trying, but we weren't lucky in that respect. I just have, there are other branches of the family which have young people and children in them. And I don't actually know whether those kids experience any of this now. And I haven't really, because of I'm just about to publish the book, and my family are not geographically very close to me. I haven't actually discussed any of this with them, but they're going to find out soon. And then, yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
That's going to be an interesting discussion when it does happen.
That will be.
Yeah. Also,
interesting Christmas dinner, huh?
Also, Steve, you mentioned about how they don't want any bother, don't want any hassle, as we call it over here. They don't want to fight or any trouble, because that could result in the abduction going the wrong way, etc., etc. Now, there is evidence of that, as you, I know you're aware of Calvin Parker and his abduction. Indeed, you mention it in the publication yourself. Now, there is evidence to suggest that Calvin Parker not only went through a 1973 event, but that he also went through a 1993 event. And I think it was that event where he describes a female-looking visitor, for want of a better word, abducting him. I think that was the time when fingers were put up his nose into the self-same area that you've described in the book at the base of the brain, where he believes an implant was removed by the visitor. But when she did this, he turned around and he thumped her. And that, I mean, the abduction was over and done with it in minutes. Have you ever thought of maybe hitting out or something like that to them yourself?
Yeah.
All abductees, during their abductions, they are under a very serious repressive physiological control, neurological control. You want to move and you can't. You want to move your limbs and you can't. You want to lash out sometimes and you're unable to do it. There are examples of people actually breaking the neurological control very occasionally and running off or lashing out at one of the small greys in particular. And very quickly, within seconds, a control is established over them again. The neurological control that they have, particularly the instigators of the program, which are not the grey aliens, but they're beings that look like praying mantises, basically. They're great, big 8-foot-tall beings. They are extremely powerful. They can make you think stuff that you think are your own thoughts. They can make you see things because there's a way of looking into your eyes and getting into the optic nerve and bypassing the retinal observations and getting into the genticulate body and creating images that the abductee then thinks happened to them. They think that they saw and experienced these things. They didn't. They've been put into their minds. They have the control over physiology so that they can completely pacify an abductee who is unable to move anything except usually their eyeballs. And if they release one part of the anatomy, then the abductee can walk slowly in a straight line, or can be made to bend his body and lie down on a table. They can't do anything else. They don't have any freedom of action. So, having physical violence against the abductors is extremely difficult and extremely rare because of this control over the neurology that they practice.
So obviously, Steve, that's where the screen images come in again, and we do know from past stories that have come out about this.
Without this degree of neurological control and the ability to bury the memories of the abduction events way down in long-term memory, so that you just wake up, just seems like 2 hours have gone, and it's 1 second it's like 8 o'clock, and the next second it's 10:15. And you think, where have I been? And you've no memory accessible of that time. That control of the neurology of the human is extremely thorough and extremely sophisticated, and it's way beyond anything that, as a human species, that we've ever thought we could do, which ever thought was possible. They don't need technology to do this. They have it developed in themselves at a biological level. They can just do it to you with their brain, their natural body and brain. They're not using tech. These are extremely sophisticated genetic developments they have bred into them. And it's something that we are completely unable to deal with at the moment, as far as I know.
I wonder if we can ever learn to do it. If we can learn how to do it to them.
Yeah, I was just going to say this, Earl. Absolutely.
Yeah. But comes around, goes around, right?
Yeah.
Without this degree of control, there would be no abduction program. It wouldn't be possible.
Yeah.
They'd have to, they wouldn't be able to do it.
Yeah.
So they obviously have had these abilities genetically. Maybe they engineer these abilities into themselves over, a few millennia. But without those abilities, there would be no abduction program. That's what makes it possible.
I bet you that there's some
yes,
underground lab somewhere where we're trying to figure out
We're
how we
working on
can
it.
do that. I'm sure we are. That's, there's a reason why they do this
Maybe.
stuff underground,
Maybe. Yeah.
Underground or above ground. But yes, why not go for it? Earl, any questions whatsoever that you have for Steve about his experiences or what we've discussed so far, or anything that came up in the book for you?
I was really, Steve, I come from a background in nursing, and I worked in, I've done operating room nursing and stuff as well. So I've been, I really appreciated the scientific work that you put into this. I could tell that you had this medical background, and I never thought about that nerve that's in the nasal cavity there but it does go straight to the brain and can go to the hypothalamus and all those areas. And we see so many people, just like happened to you, they'll have a sneezing fit and out comes a little pill-shaped object.
Yes.
And but I've never seen it expressed before medically, why that would work and why that would be the place where they would put an implant. And that was very very poignant to me.
I'll add something in here that is a part, not just of my understanding of exactly what you're saying here, to the degree that I get it without a technical background, but a very central memory for me of my family history. About the time, give or take 6 months, that my sister and I had our life-changing UFO sighting, and that she had conscious memories to the end of her life of specific moments in that abduction procedure. I remember one night, I was 13 or 14, sleeping soundly and waking up to some activity in the hallway and a light going on in the hallway. My two sisters shared a room. I had my own room. And, you're up. I walked into the hallway half asleep, and there was activity going on. My parents weren't in their room. My mother was sitting by my sister in her bed. Anne was still fast asleep, and my dad was standing off to the side. Both my sister and my father had ragweed and other pollen allergies that during the spring especially would wreak havoc and sneezing fits. And Helen also had asthma and always slept with a box of tissues by her bed. And I remember looking in the room and my eye immediately going to the pillowcase below her head, because part of it was now defined by a bright, bright red shape. She had nosebleeds occasionally, but she had woken up, and as we spoke, she told me she had a sneezing fit. And my parents were so concerned. My mother had a cousin who was an ear, nose, and throat doctor several times away, and she called him in the middle of the night and woke him up. And I don't remember which parent drove my sister to the doctor about dawn, and my other sister and I home with the other parent. But Helen told me after the fact that he looked up her nose with a light and asked her if she had ever stuck a pencil up her nose with a very sharp point. She said no. And he kind of insulted her by saying, well, you must have, because that's the only thing I, in so many words, could think of that could account for what I'm seeing up there. She then told me that she had had a sneezing fit, and in it, at a certain point, something changed, and she looked in the tissue, and she saw what she described from a 12-year-old girl's point of view as this icky thing that, was mucus covered, but had a definitive shape, no bigger than a grain of rice or a BB. And of course, she didn't save it for medical analysis. That was thrown out right then and there. But that became part of our family history. It never happened before. It never happened after. And it was only many years later that I was able to put more of it together. And only in reading Steve's manuscript that particular detail resonated, through the life, through time for me, and added that final piece of what made sense about what had happened to my sister in that respect.
Mm. Yeah, there's a long report in Out of Time, Appendix D, which is an analysis of an implant removed from an abductee by Dr. Roger Lear's team and another surgeon called Mastriano. And the analysis as a report is written by a material scientist called Steve Colburn. And this describes the properties of one of these implanted devices and the carbon nanotubes at its core, and the extraterrestrial nature of the materials, which are isotopes with different isotopic values to terrestrial isotopes. As an example, iron has found on the Earth has a certain number of protons and neutrons, and iron from meteorites that have been recovered from all over the Earth for a couple of hundred years now have different isotopic properties. In other words, different numbers of neutrons in their nucleus, and these are only found in extraterrestrial objects like iron nickel meteorites, and they were found in some moon rocks, but that doesn't occur on the Earth anywhere. So these implants that are removed from abductees and analyzed, they have these extraterrestrial isotopes. They're constructed of extraterrestrial materials, and these kind of details are scientifically analyzed in great detail in Stephen Colburn's report, and I particularly wanted to include that in the book so that people could appreciate the exotic materials that they deploy.
Boy, I'll say.
And they're yeah,
Steve,
and
we are coming into our final moments of the show. I just want to conclude by saying, on behalf of myself and my two friends and colleagues, and I think an increasingly wide number of readers, that will be somewhat life-changing for you as more and more people involved in the subject and previously uninvolved in the subject read this unique book that you have written. Again, the book title cover is Out of Time, the Intergenerational Abduction Program Explored. It will be published on or about the 12th of this month of September. It will be available at Amazon Books. Will you add a button so that people can order it off of your website, perhaps, if they want an inscribed copy? Or
yes,
have you thought?
Yes, there will be an ebook and a paperback. I wanted to do a hard edition, but
absolutely the way to start. I couldn't agree more. And the website, and I encourage all of you who are hearing about this book before anyone else out there, and that's going to only last a matter of days or a week before the world starts to find out about this very special book. The website is outoftimebook.info. If you've enjoyed this show, please tell your friends about it. Please tell your friends about this upcoming publication. This is Peter Robbins with my special guest, Steve Aspin, Chris Evers, and Earl Grey Anderson, saying, stay well, fight for what you believe in, and be kind to each other. We'll see you next week.
Thank you, guys. Really good to meet you. Thank you, Peter. Thank you very much. See you, guys.